Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from Jerusalem. Welcome all to the second event in the series on coping with trauma in a violent reality, brought to you by the Blaustein Center for Pastoral Care at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem, Israel. In order to listen to the simultaneous translation, please click on the globe icon located in the middle of the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen and select your language. Anything that is not in the language that you selected will be translated for you. If you have any questions or comments, please type them in the chat box, and we will do our best to answer what we can towards the end of the event. Please indicate which speaker your question or comment is meant for. The event is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to all participants within a few days. שלום וברוכים הבאים לכולם, לאירוע השני בסדרה להתמודדות עם טראומה.
And he's translated himself into Hebrew now, just repeating what was said earlier. In order to use the simultaneous interpreting, you have to click the globe at the bottom of the screen. You can choose the language you wish to use. If you have any questions or comments to the team, or if you need any help, please write to us in the chat, and we will try to respond and answer the questions if time allows to. The event will be recorded. A link will be sent to all participants. I also recommend to everyone to open the chat so that you can see here and now, here and there, we will send messages to you that it's important for you to see during the event.
Messages that we'll be pasting in there from time to time to give some important information.
And now for the opening remarks. Sheikh Khalel Albaz is a muazzin, a cleric and spokesperson for the Bedouin community in Tel Sheva. He is a founder and member of many associations for peace between Jews and Muslims. Hello, Sheikh. We can start. Welcome.
Sheikh Albaz?
Sheikh Albaz?
אתם שומעים אותי עכשיו?
Can you hear me now?
لا سمعني ولا سمعهم. No.
Well, yes, just turn the camera so that we can see you, please.
שנייה אחת.
Just hang on a second. And now we can see each other. We can see and we can be heard. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Please, we're ready to begin. When you're ready, just tell me and I'll start. Yes, we are ready. Shall I start? Yes, please do. Good evening, everyone. From the Negev, from the southern part of Israel, Sheikh Khalel Albaz is speaking to you, a Muslim clergy in Tel Sheva, the Bedouin village. First of all, have denounced from every podium what happened on the 7th of October. I did this without any but, However, we are talking tonight about what is called a spiritual subject, the pastoral care or counseling to the traumas experienced by people, either directly, those who actually experienced what happened, or indirectly, those who consumed it to the media outlets. And we have two sides to this, Shekel. We have 1,200 victims, casualties, all that happened, and we saw in the various footages. And on the other side, there are some 30,000 fatalities. Israel argues that 7,000 are Hamas people and 23,000 women and children and men. And they also have their own traumas. And we, from the spiritual and religious point of view, are expected to treat and alleviate the two sides. And wherever politicians fail, we try to pray and to see how we can make some progress and move forward. We are destined to live here in this tiny plot of land called the Middle East, or Israel or Palestine, whichever way each of us calls it. Both Israelis and Palestinians, both Jews and Arabs, Jews and Christians, all those together. None of us will exile anyone else or throw them into the ocean. We were destined to leave. As a former president of the State of Israel, Rivlin, we're not, it wasn't like a decree, a fatal decree that made us live here together, but we were destined to live here together, Israelis and Palestinians, Arabs and Jews. How can we carry on with the traumas? Because there were 1,200 victims, people who were murdered here, kibbutzim that were demolished, and still 30,000 casualties in the Gaza Strip, entire families that were totally demolished and effaced from the earth. The whole world sees those sites, perhaps except for the Israeli citizens, but nowadays on TikTok or all the other channels in the world, we can view, we can see what is happening, the traumas of children, of an entire generation that was totally demolished. And we, as clergymen, we have only one thing that we can do. We can pray. We, as religious people, can say to both sides, please have mercy on us. Please have mercy on civilians on both sides. Don't take to the extreme. Don't try to connect to radicals on both sides, because that would do no good to anyone. No one is going to throw anyone into the ocean. We're bound to continue and live here. Our choice is whether we're going to be here in peace. Can we live here in brotherhood and fraternity? Can we have two peoples live in one side next to the other, or continue the traumas and the wars that have lasted 75 years until now? I have a prayer to God. God is the God of everyone. Abraham, I belong to the association of the Abraham heritage, and he's the father of all prophets, of Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Muhammad. All of them are the sons of Abraham. And ultimately, we're not even cousins, as they say. We are brothers and sisters. And brothers and sisters are supposed to live in peace and quiet. So I pray to God, God Almighty, God in the heavens, everyone's God, please let the leaders on both sides drive away the radicals and allow the ones who are looking for ways to live with one another, to live side by side, to live one in front of the other, not to ever experience such traumas in the future. Enough with wars, enough with killings. Let us give this new generation to live without wars, to live with dreams for the future, dreams of the ones in kibbutzim and the ones that have other people on the other side of the border, in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. God in the heavens, I pray to you. And all those who will hear me, please say amen, that indeed the wars will come to an end, that the killing will come to an end, and that we'll not need to deal and cope with such traumas. Only hold such evenings, only good evenings, good evening, a pleasurable evening. And let us all hope that God will indeed instill peace, and we will live in peace. Salamu alaikum. And God will have mercy on you.
Over to all the world, in Israel, in Palestine, in the world.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Albaz, and amen. May it so happen. Rabbi Professor Nancy Wiener, founder and director of the Blaustein Center for Spiritual Care on our campus in New York, and coordinator of field activities at the Hebrew Union College Institute for Jewish Studies in New York. Professor Wiener, we're ready to start.
For your words.
Shalom, salam. It is my pleasure to bring greetings to all of you from the Blaustein Center for Pastoral Counseling on the New York campus of Hebrew Union College, as we begin this very important webinar hosted by our sister Blaustein Center in Jerusalem. In both the United States and in Israel, the Blaustein Centers have been at the forefront of providing training in the field of pastoral or spiritual care and counseling. At this moment of deep trauma experienced by so many in the Middle East and around the world, the need for skilled pastoral and spiritual caregivers is greater than ever. Medical providers and mental health professionals are highly trained so that they can tend to the physical and psychological wounds. Trained spiritual care providers address another dimension of the human experience. We are trained to listen to how another human being has consciously or unconsciously come to understand and organize their world. We listen for another's deeply held understandings of what it means to be human and or how the world works for them. Spiritual care providers recognize that for some people, those understandings are informed by religious teachings. For others, they're not. Regardless of how they are derived, the trained spiritual care provider appreciates that these frameworks have helped someone navigate their world and they've helped them address and answer large existential questions. At predictable moments of transition, such as weddings and births and deaths, we humans tend to reassess who we are in the world and what gives meaning to our lives. At moments of sudden loss or change, severe illness or injury, we find ourselves asking the same questions. And at times of significant trauma, such as this one, we do the same. These existential questions are at the heart of spiritual care, and skilled spiritual care providers invite others to explore their feelings, their beliefs, and their existential questions so that they can have a greater sense of wholeness, a sense that their body, mind, and soul are in sync. Spiritual care can either be offered independently or in conjunction with other forms of physical or psychological care. For those who do participate in or identify with a religious or specific spiritual tradition, a spiritual care provider can help an individual, couple, family, or community explore their existential questions in light of the stories, liturgies, rituals, and teachings of that tradition. All of these resources can provide a container for them to negotiate life's transitions. It is in this spirit that I look forward to learning with all of you today. This seminar, hosted by the Blaustein Center in Jerusalem on empowerment and recovery for trauma survivors, will let us all consider how we can work together at this moment of deep trauma through our complementary disciplines to offer avenues for healing of body, mind, and spirit.
פרופסור רוחמה וייס היא מרצה לתלמוד ולליווי
Ruhama
רוחני,
Weiss
מנהלת
is
את
a
מרכז
professor of
בלאושטיין
Talmud
בהיברו
and
יוניון
spiritual
קולג'
care and director of
בירושלים,
Blaustein
אשר
Center at the
במסגרתו
Hebrew
הערב הזה
Union
מתקיים.
College, within which this evening
הרצאתה
takes
טראומה,
place.
מוסר
Her
וחיפוש
lecture,
משמעות,
Trauma
ליווי
and
רוחני וטראומה
Morality in
קהילתית.
Search for Meaning in Community
לפרופסור וייס
Trauma
יש
and
מצגת,
Pastoral
אז
Care.
למי
Professor Weiss
שצריך
has
אפשר
her
לעשות,
presentation, and
להגדיל את
those who
הטקסטים
need it, you can blow
בזום,
up the
צריך
text on Zoom. All you
להגדיל את
need to do
העכבר לחלק
is
העליון של הצג, ויופיע כפתור
switch
View Options.
to the left side. You'll have a
שם
button
אפשר
of new
לבחור Zoom
options, and then you
Ratio
can
ולשנות
choose the
את
Zoom
האחוזים בגודל
ratio
הצפייה,
and
כדי להקל
change
עליכם את
the size to make the viewing
הצפייה
easier for
במצגת.
you.
בטלפון ובטאבלט אפשר
On
לצפות
the
את המסך
telephone
פנימה
and the
החוצה
tablet,
לפי
you
הצורך.
can actually blow
תודה
the
רבה,
screen in and
ואליי
out
פרופסור וייס.
according to your need. Please.
ערב טוב, שלום
Good evening and
מירושלים.
hello from
כתוב
Jerusalem.
לי אוקיי, אני חושבת שזה בסדר.
Okay, I
יופי,
think
אני
it's
מקווה
okay
שאתן
now.
רואות אותי.
I
אני מדברת
hope you
בלשון
can
אישה,
see
אני
me.
מתכוונת לנשים ולגברים.
I definitely address
המטרה
women
של
and men.
המפגש הקצר שלנו בין 10 דקות של החלק
The
שבו אני
purpose of this
אדבר,
short
זה
meeting
לדבר
is
על
to
התפקיד של הליווי
address the
הרוחני
role of pastoral care
בתקופה
in
הקשה,
this
המשברית הזאת
very
שלנו,
difficult
שאנחנו
time of
באיזשהו שלב לא
crisis that
ידוע
we are
של
in some unknown
ההתרחשות
stage
שלה.
of its occurrence. the role of spiritual counseling is not only of the person who works as a spiritual carer, obviously educators, therapists, and religious people. I will very briefly use the presentation that I'm going to upload in order to discuss the way by which me and us in the Blaustein Center view the role of pastoral care, what is pastoral care, and then we'll talk directly about the crisis, the current crisis that we are in its midst, and pastoral care in it. I'd like to be helped by philosophers, psychologists, who actually defined this topic for us dozens of years ago, in the beginning or the middle of the 20th century. Erich Fromm, in his wonderful book, And Ye Shall Be as God, that was written in the 1960s, is trying to define spirituality. And he says at this point, we get to a central question. If the religious experience is necessarily attached to a theistic perception that believes in the existence of God, I do not believe so. If we expand the experience more than the conceptual system, then we can talk about a religious experience, both theistic and non-theistic alike. And then he says, what remains is the epistemological difficulty. In what term should we use? Western languages do not have a word for this type of a religious experience unless it relies on its propensity to God. Hence, the use of spiritual is very limited, and we know it because it has many other misleading denotations. And for this reason, I believe that it would be better off, at least in this book, we'll talk about experience instead of talking about a religious or a spiritual experience. He calls it as the experience, without considering the question whether a God exists in them or not. And that's exactly what we wish to do. And what is even more important is to see how many of those characteristics of what is spirituality appears. The most important thing is to experience life as a problem, a question that requires an answer. The one who experiencing life does not necessarily experience the plight of those who feel that life is a question, a problem, a spiritual puzzle that requires an answer and solution. The second thing is that all the achievements, the material achievements, are not for the sake of money. Even the academic degrees or learning, everything is subordinate to humane values that you can call X or spiritual that man has defined for himself. And the third point is that in the complex of stances toward life, there is a reference to every event from that perspective. Can it help or can it not help in making us more humane? And that is something that we're going to see in the text and the testimonials from those events. And the fifth point is the transcendence of man or woman beyond the egotistic self. Of course, without annulling that self, but rather by giving an additional greater meaning to it, to existence. And I go back in time to William James at the beginning of the 20th century and only wish to bring his definition to the personal religion. It says the most complete answer is the answer to the question, this universe that we live in, what character does it have? That's the spiritual question. And pastoral care has this reputation of a field that is engaged with accompanying people toward their death. And I believe that it's very clear why this happened, but we'd be better off changing that perception. And this is how we work with a community approach that says that with these issues and these questions, if all of these questions are very apt before death, definitely they are very apt throughout life. They're important and meaningful. And it's very clear to us why these questions are going to cause a great tumult in addition to other physical tumultuations that we're experiencing these days. And this shaking of a universe, of what it is, what is this universe that we live in? And that becomes even more pronounced nowadays. What I did in the first months of
שלאחר הטבח של השביעי
in the
באוקטובר,
aftermath of the
ראיינתי
massacre
4
of the
בוגרות של
7th of
התוכנית
October, I
שלנו, של סוגיות
interviewed
חיים,
4 alumni of our
בקיבוצים בעוטף
programs,
עזה,
all
וכולם
living
היו
in the
בין
kibbutzim
חיים למוות
around
בשביעי
Gaza, and they
באוקטובר.
all were between life and death on the 7th of October. Fortunately, all 4 and their families survived. And the interviews that I had with them, I publicized in Wiener, and I pulled a few points in order for us to see how spiritual issues are expressed in this particular event, very close to the events. And this is Irit Chefetz from the 13th of October, and these are things that she wrote on her Facebook page following the massacre. Yesterday, we were a community conquered by Hamas. For 7.5 hours, houses were burned, elderly people were taken hostage, people were murdered, buildings were destroyed, as well as cars and what have you. 7.5 hours with no army, no police, and no help. The Duvdevan soldiers who arrived were struck by the sight of their comrades collecting bodies of terrorists and of our loved ones that were killed in their homes. Nobody wanted any revenge. They only wanted them to get rid of the rest. I'd like to read from the very same date the bottom part of our friend Miri Munk, also a member of Nirim. She's 81 years old, and she sat alone in the sheltered room on the day of the massacre. After the massacre, we all convened together, and we asked Miri to offer us some insight and blessing out of the darkness that she was in for a whole day, dangling between life, abduction, or cruel murder. And Miri said very simply, please keep a clean heart. Thank you, Miri. Ilanit Swissa, another friend of ours, was a member of Kfar Aza, who lost many of its members. I spoke with her about the portion of the week that talked about the driving away of Hagar and Ishmael. I always felt for Hagar and Ishmael, said Irit, but now I say, wait a minute, I'm on the side of Abraham and Sarah. Why did I do this reversal? Why did I feel that I had to be on the side of the underdog? Perhaps because I had a religious upbringing. On the other hand, I don't want to lose my compassion, and I hurt for the people in Gaza and for what Hamas does to them. Now, I'm just totally perplexed looking at it all. So this is also a spiritual stance, this perplexity. And the last one is the Eva Mizrahi from Kibbutz Gevim, whom I interviewed at the beginning of December, and I'll read the second half of her words. I make no plans, but I am looking at the horizon. I move very strongly on the axis between the question whether I want to go back to the well-known and familiar routine or relate to the disaster that befell us as an option for a significant change. Remember the definitions of form and what she says here. These two options exist, and I intentionally do not make a decision. When the time is right, I will provide myself with answers. I think that it's very easy to see that the questions that these 4 members, these 4 friends are representing and bringing up are issues that are spiritual in nature. These are issues that ask this universe that we live in, what is it, and what is our mission in this world? And now everything is undermined. And I would like to conclude, as I said, with a question: is it possible to grow out of this inferno? And of course, we'd rather grow in other ways, but because we are here, is it possible to grow spiritually? And a few recommendations to all those who do pastoral care, no matter if it's in the classroom, in the office, in the clinic, or everywhere else. The first recommendation is to remember that the ship of meaning is being shaken. Sometimes it nearly sinks. For some of us, it is sinking. We had a certain worldview, whether it was illusory or not, but a feeling that we had a contract with the world or with God, and that contract has been breached. The first thing to understand is that trauma shakes our spiritual worldview. This perception of morality and values is shaken, and sometimes these shatter. The second point is not to forcefully hang on to old beliefs. Unlike the personal religion, the institutional religions are aiming to very rapidly recover and rehabilitate the shattered picture. They want to maintain their power, hence they want to preserve beliefs that do not stand the test of trauma. The spiritual care is very much the opposite. We have to embrace that shock and to understand that the thing that we want to draw out of this traumatic event is a more precise and compassionate picture, albeit being more painful. The third point is not to rush. Remaining in this spiritual confusion is a broken, injured gift, and still it is a gift that we can give ourselves. In this context, the role of the spiritual carer is to create a temple in time and space, in personal framework, mostly community framework, where most of the pastoral care is done, that would allow people to exist within the spiritual doubt, to look at the ruins, to be angry, to be confused, to be hurting, and to deplore those values and that God that crashed, and to wait, mostly wait for that birth, whether it comes or not come, out of the ruins. And this leads me to the fourth point, to accept with love the irreparable broken hearts. Not always will there be a spiritual birth. Not everyone will find the strength to build a new spiritual worldview or any other picture. After the trauma, there will be broken hearts that will be irreparable. Some of us, I hope only a very small part, and our mission is to recognize this helplessness and to give those broken of heart and spirit a place in the heart and in the community. The fifth point, a prisoner cannot release himself from prison. We have to find ourselves as spiritual carers, a place to put our doubts and spiritual crises. Every rabbi, every psychologist, every spiritual counselor, to look at them with compassion. And the last thing, always be spiritually humble. We have to maintain our spiritual humility. This is the time that people are seeking for someone to admire and lean on. We have to be extremely cautious and wary of it. We have to remember that we don't have all the answers. Thank you very much.
Professor Judith Louis Herman.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiss,
פרופסור
the
באוניברסיטת
keynote
הרווארד,
speaker.
סופרת ואקטיביסטית בתחומי הפסיכולוגיה של
Herman is a
האישה,
psychiatrist,
התעללות בילדים,
researcher,
אלימות
professor at the
במשפחה,
Harvard University,
גילוי עריות
author and
והפרעות
activist in the fields of
פוסט-טראומטיות.
women's psychology,
במשך
child
עשרות
abuse,
שנות
domestic
הקריירה שלה היא
violence,
טיפלה וחקרה את
incest, and
האוכלוסייה של
post-traumatic
קורבנות
disorders.
פגיעה מינית
Over
ואלימות
the
במשפחה,
decades of her
וגם
career, she
נפגעי הלם
treated and
קרב.
studied the population of
פרופסור הרמן
victims
כתבה
of
שני ספרים
sexual
בפרק
abuse and
פרסים,
domestic
Father, Daughter,
violence,
Incest,
as well as
Trauma and
victims of shell shock.
Recovery.
Professor
אשר
Herman
תורגם
has written
לשפות
2
רבות.
award-winning books,
הרמן
Father,
ידועה
Daughter,
בתרומתה
Incest,
המשמעותית
and
לתחום
Trauma and
המחקר
Recovery,
והטיפול
which
בטראומה
have been
ובקביעת
translated into
מושג
many languages.
פוסט-טראומה
Herman is
מורכבת.
known for a significant
כותרת
contribution
הרצאתה
to the
הערב
field of
של
trauma
פרופסור לואיס
research
הרמן
and
היא החלמה
coining the
והעצמה
term complex
בהתמודדות עם
post-trauma.
טראומה.
The title of her presentation
Dr.
is
Herman,
Recovery and
ready?
Empowerment
Can you
in
please
Coping
unmute?
with Trauma.
Thank you.
And I should share screen, yes?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So shall I start?
Yes, please do. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. I know, unfortunately, trauma is a very widespread phenomenon right now. And I wish it were otherwise, but since that seems to be the reality, what I'd like to talk about is how people recover. I guess the basic idea is that trauma occurs when people are rendered helpless and isolated, when there's no one to help. And so recovery is about regaining agency and regaining connection with other people. And so that's why empowerment is really sort of the central concept for trauma recovery. And basically, unless we're talking about acts of God, floods and fires and so on, when we're talking about interpersonal trauma, we're talking about abuse of power. We're talking about the ways that people use violence to impose their will on others. And so, and basically this is this relationship of dominance and subordination is something we see on every scale, from the intimacy of families to the wars of nation states to the international realms of crime and religion and business. And the rules are very simple. Those who have power impose it. Those who don't have to submit or forced to submit. And the bystanders aren't there. Either they're helpless themselves, or they don't care, or they have thrown in their lot with the perpetrator. And oftentimes it's that abandonment by the bystanders that is the most terrifying and in some ways the most hurtful to people who have been victimized. The methods are used worldwide on every scale, from the intimate scale of families to the international scale. And ultimately it all comes down to violence, but oftentimes violence doesn't even have to be used. This is from an Amnesty International report on torture from 1973 with testimony from torture survivors worldwide. Control of bodily functions, sleep deprivation and food deprivation being the most common. Constant changing of the rules. And intermittent rewards. These first four methods reduce people to a state of helplessness. You see this, by the way, a lot of times with hostages, that there are intermittent rewards. And actually a steady diet of punishment doesn't work nearly as well as occasionally randomly interspersed rewards. And then isolating people, forcing them to do things that they find disgusting and degrading, and forcing them to violate their own moral principles. These first four methods induce terror, but the ones I've highlighted in red induce shame. And in the case of this last one, guilt as well as shame. And that turns out to be a very, very powerful way of controlling people. And it's important to be aware not only of the terror that people have experienced, but the shame that they have about their experience, because It's very highly correlated with post-traumatic stress. Here are the DSM-4 diagnostic criteria. It's an up-close encounter with death or serious injury, witnessing someone being killed or injured up close, and then the intense fear, helplessness or horror, and I would also add shame. One of the things that people are often ashamed of is the fact that we are hardwired when under threat to either fight or flee. That's the adrenergic nervous system. The adrenaline gets pumping, the heart goes faster, the blood pressure goes up, and the blood flows to the muscles so that we can either run or fight. But when neither fight nor flight is possible, there's another hardwired response, and that is freezing and numbing, and that's parasympathetically hardwired. It's similar to the submission displays of social animals. And people are often very, and actually the postures of shame are the same as the postures of submission. And people are often very ashamed of the fact that they froze and that they adopted a posture of submission. But in fact, it's very common when neither fight or flight is realistically possible. The triad of PTSD symptoms involves the intrusive recall, either in nightmares or flashbacks, the hyperarousal, that is the sympathetic nervous system, stays on constant alert for danger so that people can't sleep, they can't concentrate, they're irritable, they startle. And then this other hardwired freeze response is also persistent. And so people either are feeling too much or they're not feeling anything. There's just one study among many that was done in the UK with crime victims, looking at people's shame responses. And the more shamed they were of how they behaved when they were attacked, the more likely they were to have PTSD. So, you know, the sense that they didn't fight as hard as they wish they had or thought they should, that they felt humiliated, and oftentimes people then feel ashamed of feeling ashamed, or they feel ashamed of how emotional they are, so that once they have PTSD, they're ashamed of that, and round it goes. The antidotes are the rules of equality or mutuality. Everyone deserves respect and care. Everyone deserves a voice. Everybody should be treated fairly. Everybody belongs. And we don't impose our will on others. If there are disagreements, we work it out. And those are really the rules of recovery. Something that's not talked about as much as either the fight or flight or freezing and numbing reactions, are the pro-social reactions to traumatic events. So oftentimes, when a member of the community is hurt, unless the perpetrator succeeds in isolating and ostracizing them, there is also a natural tendency among social beings like humans to rally to support the person who's been harmed, and that's what we build upon. Whoops. This is a study that was done way back in the 70s by Ann Burgess and Linda Holmstrom, a psychiatric nurse and a sociologist. They volunteered to be on call at Boston City Hospital, which was a big public hospital. And they saw every rape victim that was brought into the emergency room over the course of a year. And then they followed them up 4 years later. Most of them, other than the emergency treatment that they got, most of them didn't get any therapy. But quite a few of them, even without any treatment, recovered well. And the predictors of good recovery were kind of what we've mentioned: agency and connection. These were people who took some sort of action to protect themselves, to try to feel safer. It didn't matter what the action was. Only in the US, only about 20% of rape victims report to the police because they're too ashamed. But people did things like change the locks on their doors or get a dog, or they did something to try to take a self-defense class. And the other predictor of good recovery were people who told someone and got a positive, caring response. But if they didn't get a good response from the first person they told, they kept reaching out until they found someone who was supportive. And there was about 10% of the survivors who really seemed to do exceptionally well. And these were people who made meaning out of their the horrible experience they'd had by, in some ways, making it a gift to others. They developed what my colleague Robert J. Lifton calls a survivor mission. He described that first in the survivors of the Hiroshima atomic bombing, people who lost everything, their city, their families, their homes, everything was gone. And they couldn't understand why they survived. But they said, if I can do whatever I'll do, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to prevent nuclear war. And that will give meaning to the fact that I survived. So joining with others to try to prevent this from happening again seemed to be a very good predictor of recovery. On the other hand, isolation was the predictor of the worst recoveries. I've conceptualized recovery in 3 stages. It's not a sort of forced march, stage 1, 2, and 3, but this is more the focus of recovery. In early stages, really safety is some sort of relative safety is the project, because if you don't have some defensive perimeter then you don't have post-traumatic stress. You're still in the trauma situation. So and safety is a very social as well as a biological project. Only when you have that defensive perimeter really can you begin to really go back into processing the trauma. And that it's not a catharsis, it's not vomiting it out, and you're never cleansed of the trauma. It's part of your life story, but it doesn't have to be the whole life story. People integrate this into their own life story as they mourn what they've lost and make meaning out of what happened to them. And once that's done, and people fear that it's going to go on forever, but it doesn't. Then you can come back to the present and the future with a more expansive rather than defensive stance. And so that's when, if people have a survivor mission, for example, that's when you can really start to act upon it. As we've talked about a little bit before, safety starts with the body. If you're not safe in your body, you're not safe anywhere. So self-care, trying to reestablish biorhythms that have often been disrupted, sometimes intentionally by the abusers, getting basic health care for injuries, and the problem with addicting drugs, including alcohol, is that they are actually quite effective for PTSD, and people will take them to sleep and stuff like to try to deal with their flashbacks and nightmares, but they come at a very high price. And there are better medications that we don't have, you know, the magic bullet for PTSD, but they're better drugs than opioids or alcohol or benzodiazepines. And then from the body to the immediate environment, and of course, that's always a social project. Nobody is safe alone. Some sort of structure to one's living situation, some sort of means of support, and some kind of structure to one's day, some sort of productive engagement are really the ingredients we look for. There are medications. As I've mentioned, there's no ideal medication for PTSD, but so-called alpha blockers that block adrenaline are often good for sleep and nightmares. Antidepressants are somewhat effective for some people. And mood stabilizers are also somewhat effective for some people. Some people are able to use behavioral techniques like meditation or, you know, systematic relaxation. Some people really can't. But they can sometimes use exercise as a way of, it's a kind of mastery of the adrenaline. You're not just having these panic attacks, you're getting your heart rate and your blood pressure up, and by deciding to run or jump or do something physical that is a matter of choice. and sometimes people can kind of gain some mastery over their PTSD symptoms that way. I think things that give people structure, cognitive methods that give people structure to their days, including, making lists of small goals that are achievable and doing them and so on, can be, again, empowering. But the things I really want to stress are the relational strategies for self-care, because overcoming isolation is really such a powerful tool for recovery. And so we look for people, are there any supportive people in this person's life? Who are they? Can they, strengthen those connections? We look for natural support systems and self-help. And we also, I think there's a very powerful role in recovery for support groups. And there are lots of good studies that indicate that groups are a very effective kind of treatment for post-traumatic stress. When people are able to be stabilized in their present life, that's the time to really, when people feel ready, to talk about what happened. As I mentioned, it's not an all or nothing kind of thing, although people sometimes approach it as though it's an exorcism. But you do a little bit at a time. You try to pace it so that people don't get overwhelmed and kick up their PTSD symptoms again. And it's not just what happened, it's what you felt, what you saw, what you heard, what you smelled. The trauma memories tend to be very visceral and sensory and emotional rather than narrative memories. But as you bring all these aspects of memory together, it becomes an integrated memory. And we've got some good neuroscience now that actually can visualize the transformation of memory from where locations where traumatic memories are stored to the locations in the hippocampus where normal narrative memory is stored. There's oops, we go back to, this is a grieving process. People have to mourn everything they've lost and everything they could be that they will never be because of what happened. But people do make new meaning out of what happened. And that's something that we can bear witness to. We can't do that for other people. They have to come to that on their own. And really, at a certain point, I think in this process of making meaning, people really have to deal with existential questions. Why? Why would one person do such a thing to another person? Why do people do such things? This is a graphic from an exhibit of survivor artwork that was organized by survivors. I think this kind of looking up to the heavens and just saying, why, is something that people tend to have to face. And of course, they come to their own understanding. We may have, you know, our own ways of making meaning, but it's something that each individual has to come to, I think. People, as I've mentioned, feel like this is going to go on forever, but at a certain point, it's just their focus of interest really shifts back to the present and the future. And this is the time when people can really expand both their social networks and their and risk more intimacy. It may come up again at different stages of the life cycle. A lot of, there's a Dutch study of war veterans from World War II who did quite well in life until they retired. And then all of a sudden their PTSD came back because the active strategies that they had used to keep it at bay really weren't working anymore. And this is the time when people can really join with others to say never again. I do want to put in a good word for groups. I think they're a very much underutilized form of treatment. And, you know, one does have to learn how to do it. It's not just putting a bunch of people in a room, how to be a good group leader. But they offer people the opportunity not only to receive help, but to give it, which is a source of pride. They relieve shame, they relieve isolation. People are often more compassionate to the other group members than they are toward themselves. And then the group can kind of challenge them to extend that compassion to themselves. And they, you know, a therapy group kind of can, we think of it as a bridge to new community because it can reestablish trust in other people, especially for those who felt abandoned by bystanders. For early recovery, we have a model called the Trauma Information Group that we developed at the Victims of Violence program. It's a 10-session, 10-week group. It's quite psychoeducational. People don't go into great depth of detail about their trauma histories. But they, you know, there's a worksheet for each group. People kind of read a paragraph and then share, does this sound like something you've been through? So, you know, what is PTSD? And then, you know, all the salient issues that come up for recovery, safety and self-care, trust, remembering, etc. And of course, this model can be adapted for many different populations and has been, in fact, adapted for many different populations. Another group model that Oh, and I should say that we do have a practice guide, which I don't have a slide, but I can show it to you. Hang on. For those. It's published by Guilford, and it has both the basic model and a number of adaptations for different populations. So if you're interested in learning how to run a group, I commend that to you. The other group model that I think would be of interest was published by a professor at University of Illinois in Chicago named Mary Bunn. And her study was based on a group design for refugees that has been implemented for quite a few years now by the Center for Victims of Torture in Jordan, in Amman. And again, it's a 10-session group. They actually have 2 different models. And I think it's culturally probably adaptive in that setting for men and women to meet separately. The first is really just a safety, a kind of a how to deal with PTSD with self-care techniques. And the second time, oh, sorry. It's a therapy group with topics, but instead of being just a stage 1 group, it has topics from all 3 stages. And I've actually talked to some of the therapists in Amman, a couple of therapists who have been implementing this group for a while. And it's not for everybody. There are some people who really, they get too triggered when they, with the memory processing part. So they should stay more in the stage 1 skills-based group. But they do good follow-ups, and they've had good outcomes with this group. These are the stage 1 topics. These are the stage 2 topics. And this is the stage 3 topics. And they have done quite a large number of these groups. So it's an interesting model to think about adapting. Here's a testimonial from one of the group members. And so with that, why don't we stop? And we have, I think, some time for questions.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Professor. Before I start with the questions, there was one request to repeat the name of the book you showed.
Oh, it's called Group Trauma Treatment in Early Recovery, promoting safety and self-care. And
Thank you very much.
And Guilford is the publisher.
Thank you very much. I'm also going to translate a remark that was written in the chat. It says, "Dear Professor Judith, I thank you." Leora wrote this in Hebrew. I thank you in the name of many, many people who are dealing with long-lasting trauma, for creating the name for it, the complex post-traumatic stress disorder. For a lot of them, they were misdiagnosed, and you did a great service for a lot of people. And so Leora is thanking you of that.
That's really another topic, because the effects of one traumatic experience, where a single traumatic event where one is able to get to safety, is very different from the effect of prolonged and repeated trauma, where one is under basically in captivity in a relationship of coercive control for a period of time. And there are both the symptom picture and the recovery process are more complicated. But I'm glad to report that internationally now, the concept of complex PTSD is recognized by the World Health Organization and the ICD-11. The United States is behind the rest of the world because we still don't have it in our DSM-5. But that's another.
Thank you.
Another story.
Another question that came up was, is there a difference in the way people of different genders or ages react to this type of trauma?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, children's PTSD in children, there are often, there are the same kinds of symptoms, but they're often expressed behaviorally, and you'll often see, desperate clinging to a caregiver or withdrawal. You'll see mutism. You'll see agitation, it expressed in ways that adults don't necessarily express them. And with young children, the approach is different, because talk therapy for young children is not that effective, but play therapy can be very effective. And kids will basically tell you the story of the trauma in their play. Gender differences, yes, I think women more likely to have internalizing symptoms, withdrawal, depression, shame. Men more likely to have externalizing symptoms with sometimes, more prone to substance abuse, although both men and women are quite vulnerable. Also to risk-taking behaviors, sometimes violent acting out. It's important to note that most people who have been victimized do not become perpetrators. but there is a but there is a higher risk of becoming a perpetrator of violence, and it is higher for men than for women.
Thank you very much. Another question is, how can we help people who are already suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder cope with the current traumatic events?
Well, I think that here's a situation where getting people into support groups can be very, very useful. Because of course, once you already have complex trauma, first of all, people with complex trauma, especially from childhood, are both more vulnerable to re-victimization, and then, will get flare-ups of their PTSD. But because shame is such a powerful emotion with trauma generally, but especially with complex trauma, any way of getting people into groups where they can both gain support, but also give support, I think can be very relieving, and it's in some ways the giving of support to other people that can make people feel both that they have more agency and that they have something worthwhile to offer. And I would also see if people can be mobilized to, for any kind of first aid, help for other people who've been traumatized, practical help, and thereby be brought into some kind of community. I think once again, that sort of pulling for the the mature defenses of altruism can oftentimes help people reconnect with their own strengths.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You mentioned first aid, so the next question is actually about that. Several of our viewers are psychiatric first aid caregivers. They often have very short window of time to respond, like on a phone call, for example. What are some of the most critical and helpful things they can say in such a short amount of time?
You're not alone. We're here for you. Tell us what you need. Is there anyone out there who you feel connected with? To help people sort of if they have any remaining support system, getting them connected to it.
Thank you.
I may have I might have mentioned last time, I have a good friend whose sisters were in Nahal Oz on October 7th. And they've relocated, the whole kibbutz, the survivors from the kibbutz have relocated. And they're staying together, even though many of them have other options, because they need each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we'll pause with the questions for now. We'd love to ask you more questions if you can hang around with us till the end. But we're getting close to the time we allocated, so we'll move on to the next lecture. Thank you very much, Professor.
Unfortunately, I have something coming up, so I won't be able to stay, but thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. דוקטור איילת כהן-וידר היא פסיכולוגית קלינית, מטפלת וחוקרת דפוסים של טראומה והשתקה. היא מנחה קבוצות גוף ונפש, מרכזת שירות פסיכולוגי במרכזים לבריאות האישה ובמרפאת פוריות בקופת חולים מאוחדת. היא מדריכה קלינית ומטפלת בנפגעות ונפגעי הטבח של ה-10 באוקטובר, של 7 באוקטובר, והאירועים שבעקבותם. הרצאתה של דוקטור כהן-וידר עוסקת בחוזק, התפרקות ועמידות של נשים וגברים במלחמה הנוכחית בישראל.
תודה רבה. תודה רבה דורון, וככה באמת היה מרגש לשמוע את ההרצאות הקודמות ולקרוא את שטף השאלות שלא כולם קיבלו מענה, אבל אני מקווה שכן חלקם הגדול. אני אעלה את המצגת.
I'd like to actually put my presentation up.
ואני באמת רוצה להתחיל עם תמונה, עם דימוי ויזואלי שציירה בשבוע הראשון למלחמה, אני חושבת המאיירת נועה קלנר, ולהציע לכם, למי שמעוניינות ומעוניינים, לתת כותרת לתמונה הזאת ולכתוב לנו אותה בצ'אט. אני אתחיל מהשיר שממנו לקחתי את הכותרת להרצאה, שנקרא אני בסדר מאמי, של המשוררת כרמל דיציאנו. ותודה רבה לתמר הרמוני, ככה למדור הקבוע שלה של שירים שהיא שולחת תמיד, ושם קיבלתי את השיר הזה. אני בסדר מאמי.
סליחה, דוקטור כהן-וידר, המצגת שלך לא תופסת את כל המסך, אז קשה לראות.
אוקיי, עכשיו?
זה עוד לא התחדש.
עכשיו?
Your presentation is not on the entire screen, so it's hard to see. It hasn't renewed itself, so not yet.
בסדר?
It hasn't uploaded itself.
האיכות לא מאוד טובה, אבל נתגבר, אני אקריא. אני בסדר מאמי. נשים חזקות מתפרקות בשקט, מאחורי דלת סגורה. אחרי שעת ההשכבה, אחרי שהחברים נסעו הביתה, אחרי שהכריות סודרו על הספה, אחרי שאתה נרדם ובטוח ישן עמוק. אישה חזקה חומקת בשקט מהמיטה באישון לילה, מתפרקת בדמעות ובדממה, בעמידה ליד השיש במטבח. אף אחד לא רואה עליה בבוקר את מלאכת ההדבקה המדוקדקת שקרתה פה שעה לפני הזריחה. וקראתי את השיר הזה וחשבתי ככה באמת על הדימוי של ההתפרקות וההתרסקות, ההתנפצות, והאם היא יכולה להתרחש בשקט, האם זה נכון שהיא תתרחש בשקט.
If it can take place quietly, is it the right way it should
וככה
be?
על המהירות הזאת שמופיעה בשיר בין התפרקות בדמעות ובדממה בעמידה, ליד השיש במטבח, זה עדיין במקום שבו היא ממלאת את תפקידיה, לבין ההדבקה המדוקדקת. ואני רוצה לפרק קצת את השאלות האלה על התפרקות והידבקות. אז באמת ההרצאה המאלפת והמלמדת של פרופסור הרמן עסקה בשלבי ההחלמה. אני חושבת שלי בכלל היא נותנת את הכוח לדבר על החלמה מטראומה, שזו מילה יומרנית, אבל היא הכניסה את זה לשפה שלנו עם הספר שלה, טראומה והחלמה. ובספרות המחקרית מדובר על כך ש70% מהאוכלוסייה שעוברת טראומה מחלימה באופן החלמה ככה ספונטנית. זה לא אומר שלא בעזרת טיפול ולא בעזרת קבוצות, אבל תהליך ההחלמה מתרחש בקרב 70%, יש כאלה שיגידו יותר, 80%, אני הלכתי לפי בית שמיים. ואני רוצה ככה להתעכב על הגורמים שמעכבים החלמה. הגורם שמופיע אצלי האחרון זה הגורם המרכזי דווקא שפרופסור הרמן דיברה עליו, זה הבדידות, אבל גם גורמים כמו מצב כלכלי, טראומות עבר, דיכאון וחרדה בעבר, שמתעוררים ככה ביתר שאת כשיש טראומה, בוודאי כשיש טראומה קולקטיבית, כמו הטראומה שאנחנו בתוכה, בעיצומה עכשיו, כבר תקופה ארוכה, מחשבות חזרתיות על הטראומה, מגבירות או מעכבות את ההחלמה ומגבירות את הסיכון להתקבעות של הפרעה פוסט-טראומטית, וחשיפה ויזואלית לתכנים קשים, מה שמאוד מאוד רלוונטי בעידן שלנו היום. המחקרים מראים שחשיפה ויזואלית זה ככה באמת הערוץ הוויזואלי הוא הערוץ שהמסוכן ביותר, אחריו השמיעתי, והשלישי העדיף ביותר זה לקרוא למשל את החדשות במקום להיחשף לסרטונים או לשמוע את הצלילים. וכמו שאמרתי, הבדידות. מה גורמי החוסן שבאמת מאפשרים את ההחלמה? את הפעילות של באמת היכולת הטבעית שיש לאורגניזם לאחות את עצמו. אני זוכרת שבתור ילדה היה לי שבר בירך, ואני זוכרת את החוויה הזאת בתור ילדה ב9 שמראים לי צילום רנטגן של השבר שלי, וככה לראות את זה שחור על גבי לבן, זה היה לי, זאת הייתה חוויה מאוד חזקה, וככה אני זוכרת אחרי חודש וחצי שהייתי מקובעת ולא יכלתי לזוז, סליחה רגע, לא יכלתי לזוז ושוב הראו לי צילום, וככה ראיתי איך השבר ייתכן, אני זוכרת את הפליאה הזאת בתור ילדה, אז כמו שלעצם שלנו יש יכולת התאחות, גם לנפש שלנו יש בתוכנו את המשאבים לאיחוי. אז מה גורמי החוסן ומה הגורמים שמאפשרים את תהליכי האיחוי האופטימליים? תקווה, יכולת להחזיק תקווה, זה מאוד מתקשר גם למה שפרופסור הרמן אמרה, היכולת להחלים בתוך קבוצה, כי קבוצה יכולה לעזור לנו להחזיק את התקווה גם בזמנים שהיא נשמטת לנו. אופטימיות כמרכיב אישיותי, תמיכה חברתית, פרופסור הרמן דיברה על זה הרבה, כותבת על זה הרבה מאוד, חיבור עמוק ורחב יותר לקהילה, נתינה, זה המישן שהיא דיברה עליו, משמעות, משימה, והסלף-קר, היכולת שלנו לטפל בעצמנו, הן כמטפלות, כמטפלים, כ-caregivers, והן כנפגעות ונפגעים. רק רגע, סליחה. אז איך נשים מתפרקות? אני רוצה רגע שנתעכב על באמת קצת הבדלים מגדריים ואיך נשים מתפרקות ואיך גברים. נשים בוכות יותר, ככה השיר שהקראתי בהתחלה מדבר אומנם על בכי בשקט, אבל דווקא מאוד מומלץ בכי בקול, גורם להפרשה של הורמונים שטובים למוח, אוקסיטוצין משתחרר כשאנחנו בוכות בקול, צעקות, אנחנו צועקות באופן לא נשלט הרבה פעמים כשאנחנו באמת עם מתח בלתי נסבל, דיכאון, חרדה, חרדה היסטרית, מוחצנת. אני זוכרת שבאחת האזעקות הראשונות הייתי בבית החולים שאני עומדת בו ונדחסנו כולנו בחדר המדרגות ואחת העובדות התחילה לצרוח, התינוק שלי, אני רוצה לדעת מה קורה איתו, הוא היה אצל המטפלת והייתה בעבודה וכולם ניסו להרגיע אותה ואני אמרתי ככה למי שעמד סביבי, היא צועקת בקול את מה שכולנו בעצם כל כך התרגלנו לארוז ולהשתיק. חשיבה קטסטרופלית, הדמיונות של מה קורה עכשיו, האסונות המדומיינים, כל חרדה היא בעצם ככה באמת אסון מדומיין, דימומים, אנחנו שומעות מנשים בתקופה הזאת של המלחמה הרבה דיווחים על דימומים לא סבירים, על הפלות, על גלי חום, התגברות של גלי חום אצל נשים בגיל המעבר, התגברות גם בתדירות, גם בעצימות, קשיי שינה, שזה גם אצל גברים וגם אצל נשים הרבה פעמים, למרות שבשיר היא אומרת אתה בטוח ישן בשקט, ואובדן קול. בהקשר הזה של השפעה של סטרס מתמשך ומלחמה על בריאות האישה, יש מחקר שנעשה בבית חולים ברזילי ובדק את השפעת ירי טילים על עוברים. ישבו בבית חולים ברזילי בין נשים משדרות לבין נשים יולדות מקריית גת שלא נחשפו לטילים, שכמו בישראל, המחקר נפסק ב-2008 כשטילים הגיעו גם לקריית גת ובעצם קבוצת הביקורת כבר לא הייתה קבוצת ביקורת, אבל החוקרים והחוקרות מצאו שהסיכון של תינוקת לאמא משדרות להיוולד במשקל נמוך מ2.5 קילוגרם היה גבוה ב-44% מאשר של תינוקת מקריית גת שאמא שלה לא חוותה סטרס של מלחמה, והסיכון ללידה מוקדמת לפני השבוע 37 להיריון היה גבוה ב-50%. אין לנו עדיין מחקרים על התקופה הנוכחית, אבל אני חושבת שאנחנו נמצא מספרים יותר גבוהים בהיקפים הרבה יותר גדולים. ואיך גברים מתפרקים? אנחנו נראה אצל גברים יותר אלימות, יותר אובדנות, אנחנו יודעים שנשים הם יותר בדיכאון וגברים יותר מתאבדים. תגובות ניתוק מבחינת תקשורת, חוסר תקשורת וגם ניתוק רגשי, אבל מה שלא נהוג להגיד בפסיכולוגיה, מה שלא נאמר מתנהג. אז נראה ביטויים בגוף של המתח, הרבה תלונות על כאבי גב, על גב תפוס, צוואר תפוס, פריצות דיסק, וירוסים, דלקות גרון, קשיי שינה ואובדן קול שאנחנו, שוב זה לא נתונים מחקריים, זה נתונים באמת מהשטח שככה אספתי אותם, ויהיה מעניין לבדוק אותם גם מחקרית. אז מה אפשר לעשות? מה אנחנו כאנשי ונשות טיפול, מה העזרה שאנחנו יכולות להציע? ג'פרי קאופמן מדבר על אבל בעקבות אובדן, והוא אומר שנוכחות רגשית זה לב הטיפול בטראומה, לפני שאנחנו הולכים לכל השיטות והטכניקות EMDR, SE, כל האותיות באנגלית והשיטות שיכולות להיות מאוד מאוד יעילות, ואני גם משתמשת בהן, ואולי אפילו נעשה איזה תרגיל קצר עוד מעט במיינדפולנס, אבל הוא אומר על המטפלת להיות נוכחת רגשית בסיטואציה, כשהמטופלת מידע על הטראומה שהיא עברה. נוכחות זו הינה האחריות הטיפולית הבסיסית שלנו כמטפלות ומטפלים. עם זאת, זו מטלה מורכבת וקשה מאוד. הוא טוען שהטראומה בעצם גורמת לאדם לא להיות נוכח רגשית בסיטואציה שבה מתרחשת הטראומה עבורו. והאובדן הטראומטי, הבסיס שלו הוא מסתורי, הוא מסוכן, הוא מאיים, ואז כשאנחנו מאפשרות את הנוכחות הרגשית, בעצם אנחנו מאפשרות לנפגעות, לנפגעים, לחבר את עצמם מחדש רגשית לרגשות שהם ניתקו מעצמם. אז ככה באמת אני חושבת שהאתגר שלנו בהתמודדות עם טראומה זה לאפשר לכל מעגל הרגשות להתקיים ולנוע בין שמחה, הזדהות, אהבה, חרדה וצער, פחד וכעס וחוזר חלילה. וכשאני עוצרת את המעגל הזה באיזשהו מקום, בעצם אני תוקעת את כל המערכת הרגשית. אם אני למשל שומרת מאוד על הלב שלי לא לאהוב, אז אני יכולה להיתקע במקום של פחד וכעס. אם אני לא מאפשרת לעצמי לשמוח, אז אני יכולה להיתקע בחרדה וצער, והמטרה שלנו היא להצליח להתניע את המעגל הרגשי ולעבור בכל הספקטרום של הרגשות. אני אדלג, ואני רק אמליץ אולי לראות את הסרטון של גברת רביע, שבה היא עונה ב5 דקות ו55 שניות, לחייל מילואים שאומר כמה קשה לו לחזור מהקרב ולהתעסק בזוטות של היום יום, והיא מדברת הרבה על זמן שנדרש, גם פרופסור הרמן דיברה על זה, על הצורך לפרוק. הרעד בעצם הוא פורק את המתח ואת הרגשות הכלואים שנכלאו בתוכנו בעקבות הטראומה. אנחנו בשביל ההחלמה צריכות לפרוק, אנחנו צריכות אפשרות להתקרקע ולווסת את הרגשות שלנו. והדימוי של האומנות היפנית, אומנות הקינצ'וגי, נראית לי מאוד מאוד רלוונטית לשאלה איך אנחנו מתפרקות ואיך אנחנו מאחות את עצמנו מחדש ומאחים את עצמנו מחדש. והאגדה מספרת על הקיסר היפני שנשבר לו ספל התה האהוב עליו, והוא ביקש מאחד האומנים לתקן אותו, וכאשר אותו אומן לא הצליח לתקן אותו באופן יפה, הוא בעצם החליט להשתמש בדבק מוזהב ולהבליט את הסדקים. וככה אנחנו רואות פה את הדוגמאות, איך הכלי השבור הוא כבר, כאשר מדביקים אותו, הוא יכול להפוך, אנחנו במוצאי ט"ו בשבט, הוא יכול להפוך לכלי באמת של צמיחה, כאשר הסדקים צבועים בזהב ומוסיפים, הכלי כבר לא יהיה כמו שהוא היה קודם, אבל אני חושבת שהוא מקבל איזשהו עומק ומקבל איזושהי תוספת חדשה של התפתחות מתוך הטראומה. ואני מוצאת דבק הזהב, אחד מדבקי הזהב זה באמת המיינדפולנס. ג'ודית הרמן דיברה על המדיטציה, כשהעקרונות החשובים ביותר במיינדפולנס זה היכולת להיות בתוך הרגע, היכולת לתת לכל הרגשות והתחושות שעולים בתוכי מקום ללא שיפוטיות, עם קבלה, ללא ביקורת וללא שיפוטיות, וכשאין לנו את השיפוטיות גם יש לנו אפשרות להיות עם מודעות יותר גבוהה לכל ספקטרום הרגשות שעולים בתוכנו. ואני הייתי רוצה להציע לעצמנו ככה לעשות עכשיו ביחד, תרגול מאוד מאוד קצר של מיינדפולנס. יש לנו פה עוצמה של ככה כמה מאות משתתפות ומשתתפים, ואני חושבת שלהרגיש את זה בתוך קבוצה ולמקד את תשומת הלב בהתאם להנחיות שאני אתן, יש לזה הרבה עוצמה של ריפוי, גם כלפי עצמנו וגם כלפי כל מי שאנחנו חושבות וחושבים עליהם עכשיו, החטופים, החטופות, הפצועות, הפצועים, המשפחות השכולות. אז בואו נמצא תנוחה, מי שזה מתאים לה, לא נמצא נוחה בכיסא, אפשר לעצום עיניים, אפשר למקד את המבט בנקודה מסוימת, וממש ככה לכמה רגעים נעמיק את הנשימה, נשים לב לכניסת האוויר לגוף בזמן השאיפה, ליציאת האוויר מן הגוף בזמן הנשיפה, ניקח כמה נשימות עמוקות, ונפנה תשומת הלב לנשימה. אפשר לשאוף אוויר דרך האף, ולנשוף דרך הפה, ולשים לב לתחושות ולרגשות שעולים בגוף ברגע הזה. לתת מקום לכל מה שעולה. ללא שיפוטיות או ביקורת. תשומת לב והתבוננות בתחושות וברגשות שעולים בתוכי ברגע הזה. ואני רוצה להציע למי שזה מתאים, תוך כדי תשומת הלב הזאת, להסתכל במסך ולכתוב, אפשר לכתוב בצ'אט למי שזה מתאים, או לעצמכם. הראש שלי כמו למשל, הראש שלי סחרחר כרכבת הרים, הרגליים שלי כבדות כמו בולי עץ, העיניים שלי כמו, למי שזה מתאים אפשר לכתוב לנו את זה בצ'אט ולשתף. הפה שלי כמו, האוזניים שלי כמו, החזה שלי כמו, הבטן שלי כמו, הידיים שלי כמו, הרגליים שלי כמו, הנשימה שלי כמו. ואני ככה באמת חושבת ומרגישה, ומתוך התנסות שלי גם בעבודה עם הרבה מטפלות ומטפלים בתקופה הזאת, ועם שורדות ושורדים, שהרגע הזה של תשומת לב ברכות והתבוננות בתחושות, בגוף, ברגשות, זה יכול להיות כמו דבק הזהב שעוזר לנו לאחות את עצמנו בקצב הנכון לנו, מאפשר לנו להתחבר למשאבי הריפוי וההחלמה והאיחוי שנמצאים בתוכנו. אז תודה רבה. ונשמח לשמוע שאלות. אני רק רוצה להפסיק את השיתוף רגע.
תודה רבה, דוקטור איילת כהן-וידר. יש כאן שאלה, כיצד את רואה את ההבדל העיקרי בין טראומה לאובדן טראומטי, כמו ההורים שאיבדו את ילדיהם במסיבה לדוגמה?
אז בהחלט גם פרופסור הרמן הראתה את ההגדרה של ה-DSM אמנם הקודם, אבל זה לא השתנה, שגם סכנת חיים או סכנת מוות שקורית לאדם קרוב, זה בהחלט טראומה. אז האירוע עצמו של ההודעה הוא הטראומה. כל טראומה היא כרוכה באובדן. אמנם לא כל אובדן כרוך בטראומה, אבל כל טראומה כרוכה באובדן, ואובדן טראומטי הוא בהחלט גם טראומה. ואנחנו רואים את ההורים השכולים בהחלט כמעגל ראשון של הטראומה. כמובן שבעוטף אנשים חוו את הכל, חוו גם את האירועים הטראומטיים וגם את האובדנים נגד עיניהם, אבל לפני ההורים שאיבדו את ילדיהם במסיבה, הזמן שהם לא ידעו מה קורה איתם הוא בהחלט טראומה. זמן ההודעה הוא זמן מאוד מאוד טראומטי, בגלל זה אנחנו גם כל כך, אני יכולה להגיד כאימא לחייל שהיה הרבה זמן בעזה עכשיו, בגלל זה אנחנו כל כך בדאגה מההודעה, כי היא מגיעה באופן מאוד מאוד מפתיע, ללא שום אפשרות להתכונן אליה. אז תודה על השאלה, זו הבחנה חשובה, ואני חושבת שבאמת חשוב להבין שאובדן טראומטי הוא טראומה בפני עצמה.
תודה רבה. מאיה שאלה את פרופסור הרמן, אבל אולי את יכולה להוסיף משהו בעניין הזה, של איך אפשר לבסס תחושת ביטחון בנפגעי השביעי לעשירי, כאשר המלחמה ממשיכה, כאשר הטראומה הציבורית כל כך משמעותית, וכאשר האמון בכל המערכות שהיו אמורות להגן על כולנו נשבר.
כן, אני חושבת שאנחנו באמת, יש ספר שאני מאוד ממליצה עליו, של פמה צ'ודרון, כשהדברים מתפרקים. מה קורה כשהדברים מתפרקים? אז זה נורא קשה כשהדברים מתפרקים, אבל זה מחייב אותנו לחפש משאבים חדשים. גם רוחמה דיברה על המשאבים הרוחניים, על המשאבים הרגשיים, על לגלות אפשרויות חיבור חדשות לחברה שאני חיה בתוכה, חיבור למשימות בעלות משמעות, וחיבור לעוגנים הפנימיים שבתוכנו, וליכולת שלנו לעבור את זה ביחד. אני חושבת כשאנחנו מגלים שאין לנו הורים, אז אנחנו מגלים כוחות של גדילה עצמית בתוכנו, ואני חושבת שזה התהליך שאנחנו נמצאות בתוכו עכשיו, של למצוא את העוגנים החדשים ולהתפתח מתוכם, עם ההבנה שהיכולת של המדינה והמוסדות לסייע לי היא מאוד מאוד מוגבלת. עם כל הכאב והצער, זה גם כרוך באבל, באמת בתהליך של אבל וצער ומציאה של אפשרויות חדשות. השם של הספר הוא כשהדברים מתפרקים, של פמה צ'ודרון. אני עונה פה לשאלה שקראתי. אני רוצה להמשיך עוד רק משפט אחד למאיה. מירי דיברה בהרצאה של רוחמה, של פרופסור וייס, היא ציטטה את מירי שאמרה, תשמרו על לב נקי. אני חושבת שהלב הנקי הוא משאב מאוד מאוד משמעותי, שאנחנו אולי מחזקות את החיבור שלנו אליו כשדברים מסביב מתפרקים.
תודה רבה. תודה רבה, דוקטור כהן-וידר, איילת. תודה רבה לכל המרצות. תודה גדולה מאוד מאוד לנועה הר זהב, למיכאל ברטמן ולסלים יגמור שעזרו מאוד ועל כל העבודה הרבה והקשה. כמה הודעות, אני אזכיר שהאירוע הזה הוקלט, ובעזרת השם נעלה את ההקלטה על הרשת תוך זמן קצר, כמה ימים, ונשמח לשלוח אל כל המשתתפים והמשתתפות את הלינק, ושם גם תוכלו לראות את כל המצגות עם כל השקופיות שהיו כאן אם פספסתם. בנוסף לכך, הדבקתי מספר הודעות בצ'אט, אני אדביק אותם שוב, ובהם לינקים חשובים, בעיקר לינק להקלטה של האירוע הקודם, האירוע הראשון, הרשמה לקבלת עדכונים מאיתנו על התוכניות שלנו ועל המשך הסדרה, כמו כן לינק לתמיכה שלכם, אם יש לכם את האפשרות אנחנו מאוד נשמח, לתמיכה בפעילות של מרכז בלאושטיין והמשך הסדרה הזו, וגם משוב שאנחנו גם נשלח אליכם למייל, אבל אני גם אדביק פה את הלינק כדי שתוכלו לענות על השאלות עוד כשהכל טרי, אם יש לכם זמן. תודה רבה לכולם, לכל האורחים שלנו שהיו כאן איתנו הערב, כל המצטרפים אלינו, ולילה טוב מירושלים. אני אדביק את ההודעות בצ'אט שתוכלו לראות.